The September morning started like any other for Sarah Thompson. She navigated her black Mercedes through the tree-lined streets of downtown Atlanta, mentally preparing for her upcoming federal prosecution case. 15 years of legal experience had taught her to anticipate every detail, plan for every contingency. Yet nothing had prepared her for what this particular morning would bring. Her phone buzzed with a message from her assistant. A key witness had arrived early at the courthouse, eager to review testimony before the afternoon's proceedings. Sarah checked her watch. 8:45 a.m. She had precisely 45 minutes to make a 20-minute drive. Plenty of time, she thought, until construction forced her to detour through unfamiliar residential streets. The sun glared through her windshield as she approached an intersection. The light turned yellow, and Sarah made a split-second decision to proceed through, knowing she had more than enough time to clear it safely. Her rear wheels had barely crossed the line when red and blue lights flashed in her mirror. Her heart sank. In 15 years of driving, she'd never received a single ticket. Officer James Mitchell approached her vehicle with the practiced stride of someone who'd done this thousands of times. Sarah kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, a habit born from both professional knowledge and personal experience. As he reached her window, she noticed his hand casually resting on his holstered weapon, a detail that didn't escape her prosecutor's trained eye. License, registration, and insurance, he stated flatly, not yet making eye contact. Sarah reached slowly for her glove compartment, retrieving the documents along with her Bar Association card. The morning sun caught the gold federal prosecutor's badge pinned to her lapel, but Officer Mitchell seemed uninterested in anything beyond the basic documents. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" His tone carried the weight of authority, a familiar script Sarah had heard countless times from the witness stand. "No, sir, I don't," Sarah responded, maintaining the professional courtesy she'd learned was essential in these situations. "I proceeded through the yellow light with adequate time to clear the intersection safely." Officer Mitchell's pen scratched against his notepad. "You ran a yellow light that was turning red. That's a violation of City Traffic Code 31-27. He paused, finally looking directly at her. "In this jurisdiction, if you can safely stop for a yellow light, you're required to do so." Sarah felt her prosecutor's instincts kick in. The intersection had no camera, making it a matter of perspective rather than definitive evidence. She opened her mouth to respond but thought better of it. Years of courtroom experience had taught her when to speak and when to save her arguments for the proper venue. "Sign here," Officer Mitchell said, extending a citation. "This is not an admission of guilt, just an acknowledgement that you received the ticket. Your court date is listed at the bottom. Have a safe day." As the officer walked away, Sarah examined the ticket. $300 fine or court appearance. She pulled out her phone, rescheduled her morning meetings, and made a mental note to request the intersection's traffic camera footage, if it existed. As she merged back into traffic, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this routine traffic stop would become something more significant. Her instincts, honed by years of prosecuting federal cases, rarely led her astray. What she didn't know yet was how this simple yellow light violation would expose deep-seated biases within the very system she'd devoted her life to serving. 2 weeks passed, and Sarah found herself walking through the metal detectors of the municipal courthouse, a building she rarely visited since most of her work took place in federal courts. The security guard did a double take, recognizing her from federal proceedings, but said nothing as she placed her belongings in the plastic bin. The traffic court waiting area felt like a different world from her usual environment. Instead of the polished marble and mahogany of federal court, the room had vinyl floors that had seen better days and rows of hard plastic chairs filled with anxious citizens. The air carried the distinct scent of institutional cleaning products and too many people in too small a space. Sarah chose a seat in the middle row, her prosecutor's instincts kicking in as she observed the room. A young mother tried to quiet her restless toddler while reviewing her ticket. An elderly gentleman in work clothes kept checking his watch, probably worried about missing his shift. A group of college students huddled together, sharing worried whispers about insurance rates and parent reactions. Judge Michael Richardson's reputation preceded him in whispered conversations around the room. "He never reduces fines," murmured a man in a business suit to his left. "Doesn't matter what you say." Sarah listened carefully, noting how the other defendants shared their stories, mostly working-class people who could ill afford the fines they were about to face. The bailiff entered at precisely 9:00 a.m., his voice cutting through the murmur. "All rise. Traffic court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Michael Richardson presiding." The judge swept in, his black robe billowing slightly as he took his seat. Sarah noticed how he barely acknowledged the room before diving into his docket. Case after case moved through like clockwork. A speeding ticket. Guilty, $150. Rolling stop. Guilty, $200. Expired registration. Guilty, $175. Sarah watched Judge Richardson's methodology unfold. He rarely made eye contact with defendants, his attention fixed on the papers before him. His questions were perfunctory, his interruptions frequent, his decisions swift, and almost always adverse to the defendants. What caught Sarah's attention most was the pattern in his interactions. She noticed how he allowed certain defendants to fully explain their situations while cutting others off mid-sentence. The disparities were subtle but unmistakable to her trained eye. A well-dressed white businessman received a reduced fine for an illegal U-turn after a lengthy explanation. Minutes later, a Hispanic woman trying to explain her broken taillight in accented English was curtly fined the maximum amount. The clock on the wall ticked past 10:30 a.m. as Sarah reviewed her own evidence one last time. She had managed to obtain screenshots from a nearby business's security camera showing her car's position when the light changed. In her briefcase sat printed copies of the relevant traffic codes and 3 precedent cases regarding yellow light violations. She was prepared, just as she would be for any federal case. Yet something felt different here. The familiar weight of her federal prosecutor's badge seemed heavier today as she watched Judge Richardson's rapid-fire judgments. She recognized the subtle dance of power and prejudice playing out before her, having witnessed it countless times from the other side of the courtroom. But today, she wasn't here as a prosecutor. Today, she was just another defendant in traffic court, and her case number was getting closer. A young public defender caught her eye from across the room and gave her a knowing look. They had faced each other in federal court last month, and now he seemed curious to see how this would play out. Sarah straightened her suit jacket and checked her phone one last time. 5 cases to go before hers. Case number 2374. Sarah Thompson, yellow light violation on Peachtree Street. The bailiff's voice echoed through the now hushed courtroom. Sarah rose with the practiced grace of someone who had stood before judges hundreds of times, though usually on the other side of proceedings. As she approached the podium, she felt dozens of eyes following her movement, the other defendants suddenly more alert, perhaps sensing something different about this case. Judge Richardson continued reading through papers on his bench, not bothering to look up. His silver-rimmed glasses sat low on his nose, a position that allowed him to peer over them with what Sarah had observed was his signature look of disapproval. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows across his face, deepening the lines around his mouth that seemed permanently set in a slight frown. "Miss Thompson," he began, still not looking up, his tone carrying the same dismissive edge she'd heard him use with several other defendants. "You're charged with failing to stop at a yellow light when it was safe to do so. How do you plead?" Sarah cleared her throat softly. "Not guilty, Your Honor. I'd like to present evidence that demonstrates I had cleared the intersection safely and legally." She reached for the security camera screenshots in her folder. "Miss Thompson," Judge Richardson interrupted, finally glancing up but looking past her rather than at her. "I've heard every possible excuse about yellow lights today. The officer's report clearly states you could have stopped safely, unless you have something new to add." The condescension in his voice was palpable. Sarah noticed how his hand had already begun moving toward his gavel, a gesture she'd seen him make when he'd already decided the outcome. but 15 years of prosecuting federal cases had taught her to stand her ground professionally. Your Honor, if you'll allow me to present my evidence, I believe you'll find that Officer Mitchell's perspective doesn't align with the objective facts. I have security camera footage that shows. Miss Thompson, he cut in again, this time with an edge of irritation. This is traffic court. We don't have time for elaborate presentations. The officer is a trusted member of law enforcement with years of experience. Are you suggesting he was somehow mistaken in his professional judgment? Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline she usually experienced during crucial cross-examinations. She noticed how Judge Richardson's interruption of her defense was markedly different from his patient listening to previous defendants, particularly the white male business executive who had spent 5 minutes explaining his illegal U-turn. Your Honor, I am not questioning the officer's integrity. I am merely exercising my right to present evidence in my defense, as guaranteed by. The sharp rap of the gavel cut through her words. Ms. Thompson, I'm familiar with defendant's rights. His tone carried a patronizing weight that made several observers shift uncomfortably in their seats. What I'm not familiar with is why this simple traffic violation requires such elaborate argument. The fact is, you were observed running a yellow light when you could have stopped safely. The young public defender who had noticed her earlier was now watching intently, his legal pad forgotten in its hands. Sarah stood perfectly still, her posture remaining professional despite the judge's dismissive treatment. She had one more card to play, one that she had hoped wouldn't be necessary. But Judge Richardson's behavior was forcing her hand. She took a deliberate breath, preparing to reveal her position at the U.S. Attorney's Office. The irony wasn't lost on her, that she would need to invoke her professional status to receive the basic courtesy of being heard in a court of law. The tension in the courtroom had reached a palpable level as Judge Richardson leaned forward, his impatience evident in every movement. Sarah stood firm, her evidence still clutched in her hand, untouched and unexamined. The morning light filtering through the high windows cast stark shadows across the judge's bench, creating an almost theatrical atmosphere for what was about to unfold. Miss Thompson. Judge Richardson's voice carried an edge that made even the bailiff glance up from his paperwork. I've listened to quite enough. This court has a full docket today, and we cannot afford to spend excessive time on a simple traffic violation. Sarah felt her jaw tighten, recognizing the familiar pattern she'd witnessed countless times before, not just in this courtroom, but throughout her legal career. She had watched for the past 2 hours as other defendants, particularly white males, were given ample time to explain their circumstances. One man had spent nearly 15 minutes describing how his speedometer was slightly miscalibrated. Your Honor, I have documentary evidence that directly contradicts the officer's assessment. The security camera footage shows. $300, Judge Richardson announced, his gavel already rising. That's $50 more than the standard fine, Miss Thompson, to reflect your persistent attempts to waste this court's time. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The young mother Sarah had noticed earlier pulled her child closer, while the public defender furiously scribbled notes. The fine was notably higher than any other yellow light violation handled that morning. Most had been reduced to $150 or dismissed entirely. Sarah's legal training warred with her personal indignation. She had spent years standing before judges, building cases, presenting evidence. She knew the system inside and out, its strengths, its flaws, and most importantly, its obligations to every citizen who stood before it seeking justice. Your Honor, she began again, her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. I must respectfully note for the record that you haven't allowed me to present any evidence in my defense. Furthermore, the enhanced fine appears to be punitive, based solely on my attempt to exercise my legal right to. The gavel cracked down again, harder this time. Miss Thompson, you're bordering on contempt. Pay the fine within 30 days or face additional penalties. Next case. Several observers exchanged knowing looks. An elderly black man in the back row slowly shook his head, a gesture that spoke volumes about similar experiences. The college students who had been whispering earlier fell silent, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. Sarah remained at the podium, her evidence still unexamined in her hands. 15 years of prosecutorial experience had taught her to recognize moments like these, moments when justice wasn't just blind, but willfully looking away. She thought of every defendant she had ever prosecuted, remembering how she had always ensured they received a fair hearing, even when the evidence against them was overwhelming. The bailiff stepped forward, preparing to usher her away from the podium. But Sarah Thompson hadn't become a federal prosecutor by backing down from injustice. She squared her shoulders, channeling the same authority she used in federal court. The next words she would speak would change the entire dynamic of the room, though Judge Richardson didn't know it yet. She could already feel her federal prosecutor's badge pressing against her like a shield, ready to be revealed. The irony wasn't lost on her, that she would need to invoke her professional status to receive the basic respect that should be afforded to every citizen standing before the law. Your Honor, Sarah's voice cut through the tension with the precision of a surgeon's blade. Before this case concludes, I need to state for the record that as Assistant United States Attorney Sarah Thompson, I find your refusal to examine evidence in a court of law deeply troubling. The effect was immediate and electric. Judge Richardson's hand, which had been reaching for the next case file, froze mid-motion. The bailiff, who had taken one step toward Sarah to escort her away, suddenly retreated. The subtle sounds of the courtroom, shuffling papers, whispered conversations, creaking chairs, all ceased at once. Judge Richardson slowly removed his glasses, truly looking at Sarah for the first time since she'd entered his courtroom. Recognition flickered across his face like a slideshow of memories. Sarah presenting federal cases in his courtroom last month, conferring with the U.S. Attorney at legal functions, being quoted in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution about a major corruption case she'd won. Miss Thompson, he began, his voice notably softer, almost stumbling over her name. I hadn't realized you were with the U.S. Attorney's office. The change in his tone was so dramatic that several defendants exchanged knowing glances. The young public defender in the gallery was now openly taking notes, his pen moving rapidly across his legal pad. Sarah maintained her professional composure, though she could feel her heart pounding against her ribs. This was the moment when many would have accepted the judge's inevitable backtracking, taken the offered olive branch of professional courtesy. But Sarah Thompson hadn't become a federal prosecutor by accepting systemic injustice. Yes, Your Honor, I am. And I find it concerning that this information would affect how my traffic citation is handled. She paused, letting the words hang in the air. Every person who stands before this bench deserves the same opportunity to present evidence and receive a fair hearing, regardless of their profession and regardless of their appearance. The implied accusation of bias made Judge Richardson's face flush red. The other defendants in the courtroom, who had watched case after case being processed like items on a conveyor belt, sat forward in their seats. They were witnessing something rare. The system's casual inequality being called out by one of its own. Well, Ms. Thompson, Judge Richardson adjusted his robe, clearly trying to regain his authoritative demeanor. Perhaps we should discuss this matter in chambers. I'm sure we can come to a reasonable resolution that. Your Honor, Sarah interrupted, something she would never normally do. My concern isn't about resolving my case in private. It's about the equal application of justice in this courtroom. The camera footage I attempted to present, the legal precedents I wanted to cite, the basic right to be heard. These aren't special privileges that should be reserved for federal prosecutors or any particular group. They're fundamental rights that belong to everyone who enters this courtroom. The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Richardson's face had gone from red to pale, his usual confident demeanor completely shattered. The bailiff stood awkwardly between them, unsure whether to enforce the judge's earlier dismissal or wait for new instructions. The court clerk had stopped typing, her hands hovering over the keyboard as she waited to record whatever happened next. Sarah could feel the weight of the moment, understanding that this wasn't just about a traffic ticket anymore. It had become something much larger, a spotlight on the subtle biases that plagued the justice system, exposed in one brief but revealing interaction. The following moments in the courtroom unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance, with Judge Richardson attempting to regain control of a situation that had already spiraled beyond his grasp. His earlier dismissive demeanor had vanished, replaced by an almost obsequious friendliness that made several observers exchange knowing looks. "Miss Thompson," he began, his voice carrying a warmth that had been notably absent minutes before, "I apologize if there has been any misunderstanding. Perhaps we could take a brief recess and discuss this matter in my chambers. I'm sure we can reach an appropriate resolution that satisfies all parties." Sarah stood firm at the podium, her legal training and years of courtroom experience evident in her steady posture. The same evidence folder she had tried to present earlier remained in her hands, a physical reminder of the justice denied just moments ago. "Your Honor," she responded, her voice clear and measured. "I appreciate the offer, but I must decline. The issues raised here today shouldn't be resolved behind closed doors. The fundamental right to present evidence and receive a fair hearing isn't something that should be negotiated in chambers. It's something that should be guaranteed in open court to every citizen who appears before you." The public defender who had been taking notes began writing even more furiously. In the gallery, the young mother who had been anxiously waiting her turn watched with undisguised hope, while the college students whispered among themselves, phones discreetly recording the unprecedented scene. Judge Richardson's fingers drummed nervously on his bench, a habit Sarah had noticed earlier when he was processing cases he found tedious. "Miss Thompson, I assure you that this court takes all cases seriously. If you feel your evidence wasn't properly considered, with all due respect, Your Honor," Sarah interjected, her prosecutor's instincts taking over, "this isn't about my case alone. I've observed this court for several hours today. I've watched as some defendants were given ample time to present their cases, while others were summarily dismissed. I've noted the disparities in fines, the inconsistent application of discretion, and the varying degrees of respect afforded to different defendants." The court clerk's typing had slowed to a halt again, her eyes darting between Sarah and the judge. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably, his usual stoic expression betraying a hint of agreement with Sarah's words. "I will be following the standard appeals process," Sarah continued, "not because I need special treatment as a federal prosecutor, but because every citizen has the right to challenge an unjust ruling. More importantly, I believe this incident merits a broader discussion about judicial conduct and equal treatment under the law." Judge Richardson's face had grown increasingly pale. His earlier attempt at damage control had backfired spectacularly, transforming a simple traffic court session into what could become a significant examination of judicial practices. "Miss Thompson, he started, but Sarah had already gathered her belongings. "Thank you, Your Honor. I'll have my office submit the formal appeal by the end of the week, and I suggest the court maintain today's records carefully. They may prove relevant to broader discussions about judicial oversight and bias training." As Sarah turned to leave, the other defendants in the courtroom sat straighter, several nodding in quiet approval. The young public defender quickly packed his notes, clearly recognizing the potential precedent this case could set. Judge Richardson remained frozen on his bench, the weight of what had just transpired settling over the courtroom like a heavy cloud. By the following morning, Sarah's traffic court confrontation had become the talk of Atlanta's legal community. The young public defender's detailed notes had made their way through courthouse networks with remarkable speed, and courthouse staff who witnessed the exchange added their own observations to the growing narrative. Sarah arrived at her office in the federal building to find her phone blinking with dozens of messages. Fellow prosecutors, defense attorneys, and civil rights organizations all sought her perspective on what was quickly becoming more than just a story about a traffic ticket. Her assistant handed her a stack of business cards from reporters who had already stopped by, including one from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's legal affairs correspondent. "The Georgia Association of Black Lawyers called twice this morning," her assistant mentioned, following Sarah into her office. They're particularly interested in your observations about the pattern of judicial conduct you witnessed." Sarah set her briefcase down, considering the weight of what was unfolding. As she pulled out the still unexamined evidence from her traffic case, her colleague Marcus Jenkins appeared in her doorway, coffee in hand. "So Richardson finally showed his true colors in public," Marcus said, closing the door behind him. "You know, I appeared before him last year on a pro bono case. Different courtroom, same dismissive attitude. But he changed his tune pretty quickly when he realized I was with the U.S. Attorney's Office." Sarah nodded, remembering how the judge's demeanor had shifted so dramatically upon learning her position. "It's not just about Richardson," she replied, sorting through her messages. "It's about every person who walks into that courtroom without a federal badge or a prestigious law firm behind them." By lunchtime, security had to turn away 3 different news crews from the federal building. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her former law school professor, now a prominent civil rights attorney. "Need to talk. This could be the catalyst we've been waiting for." The courthouse grapevine hummed with activity. Court clerks shared stories of similar incidents they'd witnessed but never felt empowered to report. A group of public defenders began compiling data on Judge Richardson's sentencing patterns, looking for statistical evidence of bias in his rulings. Local judge accused of bias in traffic court read the first online headline. By mid-afternoon, more detailed stories emerged. Federal prosecutor exposes potential pattern of judicial misconduct, and traffic stop raises questions about equal justice in municipal courts. Sarah's inbox filled with emails from other defendants who had appeared before Judge Richardson, each sharing similar experiences of dismissive treatment and rushed judgments. The young mother from the courtroom had written a particularly moving account of how she'd lost a day's wages trying to contest a ticket, only to be silenced before she could explain her situation. The state's Judicial Qualifications Commission received 3 separate complaints by the end of the day. The Georgia ACLU issued a statement announcing their intention to conduct a broader investigation into municipal court practices across the state. Judge Richardson's chambers released a terse statement. "The court maintains its commitment to equal justice under law. Any allegations of bias will be addressed through appropriate channels." But courthouse sources reported that the judge had canceled his afternoon docket and left early, avoiding the growing media presence outside. As Sarah prepared to leave her office that evening, she noticed a new email from the chief judge of the municipal court. The subject line read, "Request for meeting. Urgent." The ripples of that morning in traffic court were becoming waves, and Sarah realized this was just the beginning of a much larger conversation about justice, bias, and accountability in the legal system. 3 months after the traffic court incident, Sarah stood at a podium in the State Bar of Georgia's Conference Center, facing a packed audience of judges, attorneys, and court administrators. The room buzzed with anticipation. This wasn't just another mandatory judicial training session, but the culmination of a movement that had started with a yellow light violation. The appeals court had not only overturned her fine, but had issued a scathing opinion about the handling of her case. More significantly, they'd ordered a comprehensive review of Judge Richardson's past rulings, revealing disturbing patterns in his treatment of minorities and defendants without legal representation. "The true measure of justice," Sarah began, her voice steady and clear, "isn't how we treat people with power and privilege. It's how we treat every single person who walks through those courthouse doors." She noticed Judge Richardson sitting in the back row, required to attend as part of his judicial rehabilitation program. The investigation triggered by her case had uncovered systemic issues that extended far beyond one judge or one courtroom. The municipal court had been forced to implement new guidelines requiring judges to document their reasons for interrupting testimony or denying the presentation of evidence. Every courtroom now displayed clear signage informing defendants of their rights to be heard and to present evidence. Sarah clicked to her next slide, displaying statistics compiled by the Public Defender's Office. In the 3 months since these reforms were implemented, we've seen a 40% reduction in appeals from municipal court. More importantly, satisfaction surveys show increased trust in the system, particularly among minority communities. The young mother from that day in traffic court had become one of the faces of reform, her story featured in a State Bar Association video about access to justice. She sat in the front row today, now employed as a community liaison for the court system's new outreach program. But numbers and policies are only part of the story, Sarah continued, noting how Judge Richardson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Real change happens in those small moments when someone with power chooses to listen instead of dismiss, to engage instead of assume, to respect instead of prejudge. The young public defender who had documented her traffic court encounter was now leading a task force on judicial accountability. His detailed notes had become a teaching tool in judicial training sessions across the state. He caught Sarah's eye and nodded, remembering how one incident had sparked such widespread change. As Sarah concluded her presentation, she shared a final thought that brought the room to complete silence. That day in traffic court, I had the protection of my federal prosecutor's badge. But justice shouldn't require a badge. Equal treatment under the law shouldn't depend on your title, your appearance, or your ability to hire an expensive attorney. It should be the fundamental right of every person who seeks justice in our courts. The applause that followed wasn't just polite acknowledgement. It was a recognition of truth spoken to power. As people rose from their seats, Sarah noticed Judge Richardson approaching the podium. He looked older, humbled by the events of the past months. "Miss Thompson," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. Not just for that day, but for every person I failed to truly see or hear in my courtroom." He paused, struggling with his next words. "Thank you for having the courage to stand up. You've taught an old judge a valuable lesson." Sarah nodded, accepting his words but knowing that true change would require more than one judge's epiphany. As she packed up her materials, she saw the next generation of legal professionals, young lawyers, law students, and judicial clerks, taking notes and sharing determined looks. The conversation about justice and equality would continue, one courtroom at a time.